The Russian Revolution, the short version, by History.com, adapted by Newsela staff. In 1917, two revolutions swept through Russia. For hundreds of years, the country had been ruled by emperors, called czars or tsars, who commanded absolute power. The revolution set in motion political and social changes that eventually led to the formation of the Soviet Union. In March 1917, growing civil unrest along with long-lasting food shortages erupted into open revolt. Nicholas II, the last Russian Tsar, was forced to step down. Just months later, the new government that was put in its place after the revolution was itself overthrown. A political party called the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, suddenly came to power. Russian Revolution. Background. By 1917, most Russians had lost faith in the leadership ability of Tsar Nicholas II. Government corruption was widespread. The Russian economy remained backward. Again and again, Nicholas limited the power of the Duma, the Russian parliament or Congress, when it opposed his will, adding to a sense of anger. So you might want to quick pause, go back and underline the problems, right? You go back, you have government corruption, underline 1. Russian economy backward, 2. Limited the power of the Duma, the king did. And this created a sense of anger. Let's move on. The immediate cause of the February Revolution, the first of the two Russian revolutions, was Russia's involvement in World War I. The Russian army was no match for that of Germany, and more Russians were killed or wounded in the war than the soldiers of any nation in any previous war. Meanwhile, the economy was badly hurt by the costly war effort. Eventually, people with moderate political views joined more extreme groups in calling for the Tsar's overthrow. So in the margins, I'd pause here and I'd write World War I, bad economy, anger. February Revolution, 1917. The February Revolution actually began on March 8, 1917. Back then, Russia used a different calendar, so it was February 23rd for Russians at the time. Demonstrators demanding bread took to the streets in the Russian capital of Petrograd, now called St. Petersburg. There, they were supported by huge crowds of striking factory workers. The protesters clashed with police but refused to leave the streets. On March 10th, the strike spread among all the Petrograd's workers and angry mobs destroyed police stations. Several factories elected leaders to workers' committees, following a system used in a previous Russian Revolution in 1905. These leaders served on a group called the Petrograd Soviet. So I'd pause. You might want to add workers take control, clashes, street protests. Make notes in the margins to remind you what you just read. I'll pause. I'm going to move on. On March 11th, so the next day, soldiers were called out to put down the uprising. In some encounters, they opened fire, killing demonstrators, but the protesters kept to the streets, and the troops began to waver. That day, Nicholas again sent the members of the Duma home, refusing to let them limit his power. On March 12th, the Russian Revolution triumphed after regiments of the Petrograd army switched to the side of demonstrators. The soldiers then formed committees that elected deputies to the Petrograd Soviet, along with deputies from the factories. So again, in a minute you should pause, but I think you should underline the army switch sides to the protesters. Underline army switch side to the demonstrators. There's no power anymore for the government. And then you say workers and army take control. Workers and soldiers take control. I'll pause. Moving on to the next page. The Tsar's government was forced out of power, and the Duma formed a temporary government to run the country instead. It competed with the Petrograd Soviet for control of the revolution. On March 14th, the Petrograd Soviet issued Order No. 1, which instructed Russian soldiers and sailors not to obey any orders that were sent against the Soviet. The next day, March 15th, Tsar Nicholas II gave up the throne in favor of his brother Mikhail. Mikhail refused to accept the crown, bringing an end to the rule of czars. Now again, I would pause in the margin, I would make a little star next to this, end the rule of czar, no more czar, so the czar's gone after hundreds of years. I would say you have a temporary government, underline the word temporary government, and then underline the Soviets, which are the worker councils. So you have workers and the temporary government kind of fighting for power here. The czar is gone. This is a pretty big moment. Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. If you haven't made those notes I suggested, I would rewind a little bit, listen back to it, and pause before moving on. Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. After the February Revolution, power was shared between the weak temporary government and the Petrograd Soviet. Then, on November 6th and 7th, 1917, or October 24th, 25th in Russia at the time, leftist revolutionaries led by Bolshevik Party leader Vladimir Lenin launched a nearly bloodless takeover of the government. The Bolsheviks and their allies occupied government buildings and other strategic locations in Petrograd and soon formed a new government with Lenin as his head. Lenin gained absolute power and became the leader of a dramatically new kind of Russian government. He made peace with Germany, took over factories and distributed land, but beginning in 1918 had to fight a devastating civil war against anti-Bolshevik White Army forces. In 1920, the anti-Bolsheviks were defeated, and in 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, was established. Lenin made the USSR a communist country in which people were supposed to share property and control of businesses and other parts of the economy. The goal of communism is an equal society, but the USSR was unable to achieve that and became a dictatorship. So, in short, you have the Tsar's rule, the Tsar enters World War I, the Tsar falls in the face of massive protests when the army leaves, and you have a temporary government. And then by the end of that year, you have the Bolsheviks led by Lenin take over and try to create a communist country. Please move on to take the quiz.